In the last episode, we began to show that the basis for the success of the 1763 method to control a commercial empire of usury through free trade via Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was to be found in the earlier Cartesian social doctrine of Adam Smith, from which the economic doctrine flowed and found its acceptance. In this episode, you will find the basis for the religious belief in free trade located precisely in the consequence of that axiomatic system. By adopting this G20 resolution, your president has effectively sold you out to the British Empire's 1763 doctrine, giving up our sovereignty to the beginnings of an international currency and a continuation of a policy of throwing your future into an attempt to bail out a failed international speculative bubble, which has been based on looting the world. The derivatives never had any value. They were like a card game where the bets are based on the bets of a card game in the room downstairs. But the assumption which the G20 attendees agreed to is that they always did and still do have value. For Lord knows, we could never get rid of the derivatives market, for where would wealth come from? No, we must maintain the sacred rights of the private property of the hedge funds. Don't try to tell me Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution deems our derivatives trading unconstitutional. Without it, where would wealth come from? Somehow, if we just get enough liquidity flowing into the system, clean out the dirty pipes, and get a big enough regulator with a new IMF having the power to oversee international trade, the market will flow once again, and the derivatives will come alive, and wealth will be reborn. Does the supranational financial oligarchy believe in this invisible hand doctrine? Of course not. Like the man who wrote it, it is their tool to destroy the power of sovereign nations. Does anyone who is running policy from the highest levels of government actually believe it? Most of them are smart enough to know that the invisible hand of Adam Smith certainly does have an intended effect. But whether they believe it is not the question. They have agreed to go along with policies which are based on these assumptions. The relevant question is, just how foolish is the President of the United States, who would eliminate anyone who threatens his honor of getting in with the Wall Street Tories and joining them in kissing the feet of their god, Adam Smith? And beyond the president, to those around him, ask, just how dumb are those who have adopted these assumptions? To what really have these White House dupes agreed? And if they knew, would they still feel comfortable praising them in public? According to Adam Smith, since we are externally determined by the sense impressions from without as a Cartesian particle, by the impartial spectator's view, we do not and cannot use our reason to come up with the proper means for what society needs. René Descartes considered man a lowly creature unable to conceive causes, restricted to his senses. Smith, entirely agreeing with this Cartesian view, said mankind's nature was to be like parts of a clock, where each part doesn't consider the purpose for which it was made. And he writes, if they were endowed with the desire and intention to produce it, they could not do it better. Only the watchmaker needs to think about the end for which it was made. All are agreed about the clock, but mankind, he writes, confounds the efficient from the final cause in accounting for those of the mind. How dare we consider that our intentions and thoughts have anything to do with the outcome of society, writes Smith. We merely carry out our animal-like instincts to be sympathetic with one thing or another. These instinctual sympathies are the means, the efficient causes, which were designed by God, and we carry them out without thinking about the ends, but only for their own sake. If one thinks that their reason can contribute anything to the final causes of society, such as the general welfare, the common defense, they are irrationally claiming to be something more than their sympathies.
Although we are in this manner endowed with a very strong desire of those ends, it has not been entrusted to the slow and uncertain determinations of our reason to find out the proper means of bringing them about. Nature has directed us to the greater part of these by original and immediate instincts. Hunger, thirst, the passion which unites the two sexes, the love of pleasure, and the dread of pain, prompt us to apply those means for their own sakes, and without any consideration of their tendency to those beneficent ends which the great director of nature intended to produce by them.
Thus is revealed the secret behind his later Wealth of Nations. Smith notes that everyone who is contemplating what makes something beautiful knows that utility is one of the sources of beauty. A well-ordered house gives pleasure to the spectator, and badly placed doors and irregular-sized windows make us cringe. It is obvious, he writes,
that the fitness of any system or machine to produce the end for which it was intended bestows a certain propriety and beauty upon the whole.
Adam Smith proclaims, the fact that this fitness is more highly valued than the end for which it is intended is the secret to economics. And just think about it. Didn't God or nature give us a love for wealth because the contemplation of the beauty of the nice things that go along with it? But if we had use of our reason, we could realize the benefits of owning palaces and estates are not worth all the trouble and toil which a rich man must exert to obtain them. But this irrational instinctual greed of man and desire for wealth is all preordained and divinely orchestrated, he writes, because it is this greed, this love for money, that leads to all progress. This is the great secret to economics, because this irrational nature of man toward greed leads to so much good.
It is this deception which rouses and keeps in continual motion the industry of mankind. It is this which first prompted them to cultivate the ground, to build houses, to found cities and commonwealths, and to invent and improve all the sciences and arts which ennoble and embellish human life.
All progress in economics comes from greed and self-interest? Yes, he gushes. It is to no purpose that the rich unfeeling landlord is entirely selfish and looks to consume all of his fields for himself. Don't worry about the fact that the individual's pursuit of wealth creates an unequal distribution, because in the end, he can't eat it all, because his stomach bears no proportion to his greed and will consume no more than the peasant. For sure, says Smith, he is going to have to share it with everyone else, including his servants who make his food, his gardeners, the peasants, and therefore, whether or not the wealth is distributed equally among everyone, or run by one wealthy man, it ends up getting around. Guaranteed.
They consume little more than the poor, and in spite of their natural selfishness and rapacity, though they mean only their own conveniency, though the sole end which they propose from the labours of all the thousands whom they employ be the gratification of their own vain and insatiable desires, they divide with the poor the produce of all their improvements. They are led by an invisible hand to make nearly the same distribution of the necessaries of life, which would have been made had the earth been divided into equal portions among all its inhabitants, and thus, without intending it, without knowing it, advance the interest of the society, and afford the means to the multiplication of the species.
Therefore, he says, since this is the nature of man and everything works out in the end, there is no reason or worth in trying to convince someone to think of the common good. If they are all selfish and wealthy, it will all work out. It is a waste of time to try and convince a selfish person to help people eat and help people get shelter. He'll do what he is going to do. The best thing you can do is describe the system of economy to him, the means, and he will throw his chips into the hole. Describe to the rich man the shelters and places where the food is cooked, all the rooms of the palace, the whole setup. That will excite him. Don't worry about being a good person. Let the little people take refuge in talking to God about their beef of the unfair competition that they face, because that's just the way nature is. Just keep the market flowing. It will end off promoting the good of the whole. Governments don't need to try and intend anything and meddle. The market will work itself out. Government doesn't have to promote the general welfare. We just need to get the system moving regularly. Regulations just to get the system moving freely, not for any particular end. It will work itself out. You lowly creatures called man can't presume to know how economics works. It's a mysterious science that works out because of a mysterious force of the market. As Smith wrote in his later Wealth of Nations, just let it alone. Don't think. There you have it. The invisible hand which runs the wealth of nations, a doctrine for dupes who would sell their nation to the British Empire. All the while Smith laughing with Shelburne that this doctrine of means and ends might just be accepted by people stupid enough to believe it. He didn't think society and economy is based on selfishness and greed. He knew society was run by an oligarchy trying to maintain power, and merely the instrument to get them to adopt a doctrine that will destroy it. Thus did Smith write outside the existence of nations a doctrine for feudal Europe and for the perpetuation of a global empire of finance, a doctrine whose chains have been fastened more and more over the recent decades since the death of FDR, and if not broken now, guarantee for us a new dark age.